Mhm.
So we had a great talk with Daniel last Tuesday. He can't make it because it's I think 3 a.m. in New Zealand,
Mhm.
but he sends his greetings.
Mhm.
And so let me introduce who our speaker is today. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining. I see some of the other speakers also in the series have joined. Welcome. Um, and thank you all for connecting. So our speaker today is Neil Spiller. He is a former editor of architectural design from 2018 to 2025. He is a former visiting professor of architecture at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada from 2020 to 2022, and visiting professor at the IAUV Venice 2021. He was previously the Hawksmoor Chair of Architecture and Landscape and the Deputy Pro Vice Chancellor of the University of Greenwich, London from 2013 to 2018. Prior to this, he was the Dean of the School of Architecture, Design and Construction, and Professor of Architectural and Digital Theory from 2010 to 2018. He was Vice Dean and Graduate Director of Design at the Bartlett School of Architecture at the University College of London from 2004 to 2010. Neil has been guest editor of 8 editions of Architectural Design and before becoming editor in 2018. These include the highly successful Architects in Cyberspace 1 and 2, uh, protocell architecture, and drawing architecture. Neil's books are Neil's books also include Cyber Reader, Critical Writings of the Digital Era, Lost Architectures, and Digital Dreams. He has also published books with Thames and Hudson as an author of Visionary Architecture Blueprints of the Modern Imagination, Digital Architecture Now, and as co-editor of Educating Architects, and as author of Architecture and Surrealism. He is also author of How to Thrive in Architecture School, a student guide for the REBA 2020. His architectural design work has been published and exhibited on many occasions worldwide. He is an internationally renowned visionary architect and has been architecturally speculating with drawing for decades. Neil Neil is also known as the founding director of the Avatar, which is the Advanced Virtual and Technological Architectural Research Group. This group conducts research into advanced technologies and into architectural representation, but more importantly, into the impact of advanced technologies such as virtuality and biotechnology on 21st century design. Neil is also recognized internationally for his paradigm-shifting contribution to architectural discourse, research, experiment, and teaching. It is really a great honor, truly a great honor to have you today, Neil. So I will give you the floor. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Lucas. Thank you for your kind introduction. And I'm going to share my screen.
Go ahead.
I believe you young people say. Um, so can you see my screen now?
We can see, yes, your browser where you have joined.
Okay. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I'm going to go to my presentation. Um, yeah. Okay. Um, yeah. Right. So hopefully you should see
Yes.
the frontispiece coming up in a minute when I
Yes,
play
we see
from
that.
start.
We see the PowerPoint. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Right. So this lecture's starts 40 years ago, really. But is called Communicating Vessels, which for the last since 1998, I've been working on one project. I've always had a great admiration for the long project, particularly people like Danny Liebeskind's Chamber Works and the other one, Micromegas, and Mike Webb's Temple Island, and Ben Nicholson's Appliance House, and long projects. Um, but I'll take you back 40 years to 1985. And this was part of my final, what you would call now master's project, but then was called diploma in London at the time. So this is 1985. So this is my thesis project, as you call them now. And it was for a School of Architecture for the Architectural Association on the Royal Opera House site in Covent Garden, and round the corner to the Florence Floral Hall, as it was then. And basically, this is the start of when I realized that I wasn't normal. I was taught by the kind of Jesuit Cambridge monks, or the second generation Cambridge monks from Leslie Martin's Cambridge School, who believed all the stuff of the time about ornament being crime and truth to materials and all those sayings that came out of sort of things. God is in the detail, that came out of sort of mid-century modernism and earlier. However, I was educated on the periphery of London in a place called Thames Poly, which ultimately became, strangely, in the cyclic nature of history, the University of Greenwich. It was provincial. But I was interested in what was happening at the AA. I couldn't afford to go to the AA, but I was interested in that kind of post-punk stuff that was going on at the postmodern, post-punk stuff that was going on in the mid-80s at the AA. So I kind of imported that and went to a lot of exhibitions and stuff at the AA. And so my thesis really was there's a School of Architecture for the AA on that site in Covent Garden. And these were just a few vignettes. It was about, I don't know, 50 drawings. Each drawing, this is one, was A1. And it was conditioned around, it was a polemic piece, really, before I knew what polemic meant. And it was conditioned around 7 atria, and around the atria were the studios. But I'm just going to show you 2 or 3 pictures of the atria, and they were conditioned by John Ruskin's 7 lamps. So there were 7 atria, and they were called Sacrifice, Life, Memory, etc. I can't remember. I haven't seen these drawings. They're in my archive. I haven't seen the drawings for at least 12, 15 years, because I've never unwrapped them. But and the archive is a long way from London. But so this is one of them, and again, it's the start of a composite thing. So there's 1-point perspective. There's a sectional elevation through the various floors, tiling patterns on the floors, etc. So each drawing of these atria were conditioned like this, of which there were 7. And then getting them all bit post-punky, bit more inspired by sort of people like NATO, the Narrative Architecture Today group run by Nigel Coates at the time at the AA, and so a little bit more quirky. And then in the foyer of the School of Architecture was the Dorian Gray column, and the idea that students would be allowed to dress up this column in their particular stylistic fetishizations of the day, and that you could take sections, both vertical and horizontal, through the column at certain points, and they would be like tree rings, and you could see various sort of preoccupations of students at the time, and they were encouraged to dress it up. So it kind of announced sort of architectural student preoccupations at the time. So this is the Dorian Gray column, and of course the first iteration has come straight from me. And this is the first drawing where I realized that actually I'm starting to develop something that's within its context at the time was quite original. So again, it's sort of detritus chic, it's postmodern, it's everything at the time, because if you remember, and you won't because most of you weren't born then, but that time in the mid-80s, particularly the AA, was very much to do with this post-punk thing, this postmodern thing, starting to look at sort of Charles Jenks was writing about the column as a representational piece, and this really comes out of that work and that reading at the time. Of course, my tutors hated all of this, which was really good for me. So the last thing you want is people telling you you're good when you're a student. Anyway, after leaving university, I uh, rented a flat with another colleague of mine from the University of Greenwich, and we decided that we wanted to do a series of drawings where I did one half and he did the other. And it was kind of automatic drawing. We'd established the ground plane, we'd established the site, and that was that. And we just go for it. And so I did the left-hand half and he did the right-hand half. And when we finished, we realized we were onto something different. And this is called schizophrenic railing. It's outside a pub in Blackheath where I still live. Not always outside the pub, but quite often. Anyway, we realized that there was something in our work that was uncontrollable in a way and automatic. And I'll come back to that quite a lot as we go through the talk. The next one, we were trying to create an architecture element by element. So after the kind of filter railing thing, we thought, oh, we'd better go back to the column and, with reference to Charles Jenks' representational column essay, which I think was published in the AD. So I did the bottom, he did the top. He was obviously infatuated with Macintosh at the time. And so that's again, that's a 5-foot-high drawing. These drawings at the time used to take about 3 months because we were working as well in very tedious offices. And then we got bigger and we started to, the drawings got bigger and we started to talk about, integrating our work in less than the half and half thing, but in different ways. So this is a drawing that Cedric Price later wrote about completing the superficially complete, and this is Nelson's column in Trafalgar Square. So I did the top and I did a bit of the bottom, he did some of the sides, I did some of the sides, so we mixed it up a lot. And again, that's a big drawing, that's 5 foot high. Then we decided, well, we were actually very clever and we're going to win some competitions and build sort of large urban interventions in European cities. And this was, again, we're sort of talking about the mid-80s, 86, 87. This is a competition for Genoa, for the Piazza Dante in Genoa. And it's a bridge, it's some traffic lights, it's a canopy, it's a big shadowy table to sit under. And so this is the general arrangement plan showing the context of Genoa. And these are a series of drawings. And I point out to you the bit on the left, which is called the Watcher, which is because that appears elsewhere. But this is basically a skit on the bridge and different views of the bridge structure, inspired by Peter Wilson's bridge building and ship shape publications at the time. So this is a perspective down the bridge, looking into the Piazza Dante, showing some of the interventions. And then 89, 90, after the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, we were invited to go to Bratislava and live in a place called Pístany, which was a kind of artist hostel that had been run by the communists at the time. And so we were invited to do a project, of which this is one, and it's for a place just on the outskirts of Pístany, a kind of Kunstforum. So it includes an art wall and various sort of interventions. And this is one of the composite drawings, which shows bridges, it shows bus stops, it shows fountains. And again, mixing up the representation on a drawing that shows both site plan, perspective, elevations, and creates these rather, although I say it myself, quite pretty things. And then we also made some quick models. So this is a bus stop for the Pístany project. This is a fountain. So we created this kind of urban drivel that because people weren't going to the Kunst Forum or Kunstmuseum in Peastony, because they're kind of associated it with the communists. And so we tried to draw people in with something that was a bit more expressive. This is a view around the other side of the fountain. Very quick models, soldered together. And then I got to 95, and I was had a friend who was a psychologist studying psychology, and she wanted a desk. And so we were interested. I was interested at the time in nanotechnology, and the desk resulted. It's made by 16 makers. Bob Shield, who later became the director of the Bartlett School, who was a student of mine. And he's a kind of skit on what's called the corpus callosum, which is the center of the brain, which is the tube that joins up the two hemispheres of the brain. So that's where that gold and silver geometry comes from. And that's the overall desk. I mean, it was about 5-6 feet long, probably longer, if you include the spikes. It was given back to me at the end because the client who paid for it then had a baby, and it started to toddle about, and she was worried that the baby was going to impale itself on the desk. So I then had it in my office at the various institutions for 25 years until leaving Greenwich, and then I sold it to one of my colleagues. So you can see the size of some of these drawings. Now, this is me early 90s. But you can see behind me, the more important thing is seeing behind me the size of some of these drawings. And again, they took a very long time. Later in 95, I produced probably the most artistic thing I've done, which is a triptych, and it's called From Genesis to Genocide. And it has three bits, so obviously it has a triptych. And this is, it's called the Trash Triptych, and this is the first panel called From Genesis to Genocide, very much influenced by the idea of Hieronymus Bosch and various sort of symbols like the owl, the black owl, which symbolizes the devil, the rotten fruit, the ship of fools, the globe. And then influenced the middle piece, influenced by Salvador Dali and his poem, Saint Sebastian. And then this is called Nativity in Black, which is again the last panel. So it's talking really about how the Rubicon of the skin. So we're starting to get into those initial projects were really kind of quite formalist. And we're starting to get into ideas. I was reading a lot at the time about nanotech, the genesis of cyberspace, surrealism, art theory. So, Francis Bacon. So these are a whole series of this sort of thing. So it's about these technologies puckering the Rubicon or the skin of the body. And that's what it looks like to get another very big drawing. And then there are series like the Bioscape Vertigo drawing, which is, talking about mitochondria and cell geometries and chromosomes and all sorts of stuff. So interested very much in medical representation as well. So again, I was commissioned for a kind of occasional table, a coffee table, for an ophthalmologist who was retiring. So I used the same tactic as I did with the hot desk, which you saw earlier. So if you look at the horizontal line in the middle of the drawing, that's a glass top. So what you see under is an elevation, and very much into sort of ribbon models at the time, and they'll crop up again. But also this ophthalmic surgeon was using and interested in the haptic geometries of how you support around the iris certain lenses that allow people to see again. So those geometries, those haptic geometries, are manifesting themselves through the glass top as a series of geometries. We didn't build this. I fell out with a client, which is quite normal. Then a competition. It's probably the last competition I made, which was probably 96, something like that, which is a series of pieces. This is in Croydon. This was a bus seat. I was interested in the time in the active sites of proteins and how they bond. So these are defined by that. So that's a plan, long elevation, a series of details. And then there's a fountain, which again is inspired by DNA ribbon geometries and protein active site geometries. And it comes out very Baroque, strangely. So I think the plan's much more successful than the elevation. Love the plan, not so keen on the elevation. But that's sometimes how it works. So when we get to 898, I'm starting to be very interested in the idea of doing a long project, as I said, and that's what I've been working on ever since. And some of the reasons I'm showing you some of the pieces that I've shown you just recently is because they all get woven into the communicating vessels. So 98, I started the communicating vessels. Two particular influences are Robert Rauschenberg and these two paintings, Factum 1 and Factum 2, where he tries to repeat the same marks. And this is a very fundamental sort of philosophical position of mine, not just mine, but also other people I'm going to tell you about. That the idea that you can everything is not equivalent. You can't repeat what you've done, even when you try hard. So these are two versions of the same kind of notion, but the joy is to do with the difference. The other great influence is Marcel Duchamp's The Large Glass from 1913 to 1912 to 1923. An extraordinary piece of art. In my opinion, the best piece of modern art ever. And we'll come back to dear old Marcel in due course. So I started to have this idea of this long project and the idea that the project would never end. So now the communicating vessels is thousands of drawings of varying different sort of media, and is about an island 2.5 miles outside Canterbury in the county of Kent, about 72 miles southeast of London, where I was brought up. And there's a little island there, reputed to be the smallest, well, Fordwich it's called, the little town. It's reputed to be the smallest inhabited town in the UK. And in that is a little island. And it's on that island, which I've never stepped foot on, but I used to ride, as all surrealists do, ride their bike around, and was fascinated by this little island. And it's a fork of which the River Stour flows around. So this is a site plan showing some of the vistas and whatever that I'm going to tell you about in a minute. So here's pictures from across the river of the island. So this isn't a thing against nature. This is a thing that augments nature. And it's allegedly, it's very autobiographical, it's psychogeographic. There's a professor of architecture and surrealism who lives on this island in my narrative. And it's often observed by a character called the boy. And the boy knows nothing about what he's seeing and describes it in a kind of faulty way. So there's very much this sort of narrative that's kind of unstable. There's another picture of the island and another. So I started by not wishing to, I wanted to make a series of kind of surrealist machines. So the first one's called the D-stools. And again, there's this view, this drawing across across the river, as we've seen from those photos. And the island is powered by the holy gasoline, which is a kind of biochemical, biotechnical grease that powers things and is highly flammable. And across from on the beginning of the island, you start to see the D stools. So the D stools are kind of little sort of boxes that vibrate when sat on, and they're about 3 buttocks wide, and each one has a kind of fishing rod, and they pull on these alembics up and down until the alembics excrete the grease, and the grease is the most powerful thing on the island, and we'll come back to the grease later. So the inside of a D stool consists of some Duchampian draft pistons, sorry, a clinamen, which we'll talk about the clinamen, some artificial lips, a teeth paver, some Duchampian disturbing mews, not the Chirico disturbing mews, and a voyeur's door from Duchamp's Etant Donné. So that's the plan. And I hear you say, well, okay, can you draw a perspective of that? And the answer is yes. So there's the artificial lips on a shelf at the back. There's the Duchampian draft pistons. There's some disturbing muses. There's the clinamen, which is this kind of wonderful thing held on a kind of angle poise. There's a Duchampian bicycle. There's the door, all on a table, and a Giacometti bird propped up at the back. There's alchemist's alembics. There's a turd-like object at the back, and it shows this splashing of paint, which comes from the clinamen. And I'll explain the clinamen in due course. So the idea is I started to get interested in augmented reality. This is early, quite early on. I wrote my first article on augmented reality in 1998. But I also got interested in the surreal nature of how these drawings could work across a variety of levels, one of which is poetry. So if we imagine an augmented reality or digital environment that flows through the D stools and is splashed with paint as it moves along, and that each of these planting plans are parts of surrealist poetry, we could remix surrealist poetry, which is very Oulipo, obviously. And so here's this landscape moving across the terrain of the D stool, out the funnel and over the sewing machine, which was so crucial to surrealist theory about the notion of beauty of the sewing machine meeting the umbrella on the dissecting table. Then, of course, I wanted to set something up that was a little bit more expansive in terms of its landscape. So I started in the early 1990s. I was invited with my colleague to go to Warsaw and lecture there at the School of Architecture there. And then they took us to Gdansk. And the thing about Gdansk was one of the centers of solidarity at the time, or post-solidarity at the time, and was very much to do with the dock gates. So I was interested in setting up vistas on the island, and where they cross from the island into the wider landscape of Fordwich and the village that I was brought up on, Sturry. So but I wanted to create these kind of aerogel kind of gates that drifted like cigarette smoke at the end of these vistas. I'll talk about the vistas in a minute, but so the idea was if you put a small antennae on a wasp's forehead and let it buzz about, you can then take those trajectories into a computer, hand them, and create these kind of ethereal gates. So that's what this drawing's about. And there's a bad collage done by an assistant. And then I wanted some more input devices for these vistas, and I wanted those vistas to be dynamic. So this is the Velázquez machine. And I wanted to take a series of vectors and ideas from around the history of art and program them into vectors and velocities on the island for a vista. So this is the Velázquez machine, which is, in my mind, is situated in the elliptical galleries that Monet's water lilies are in. And it references very much sort of artists' narcissism, but also Salvador Dali's Fried Egg on a Plumb Line, which is about the Spanish vernacular painting and all sorts of stuff. So the idea was that a fish would be put into this kind of rib cage thing, and it would rattle about and had a sensitive tongue, and then they would dance up and down within that, impregnating it with hydrochloric acid, a series of roux objects. And I'll show you the roux objects. And then bits of fish fall onto the tongue, and the tongue starts to relay information about positioning relative to the vistas on the island. So this is a roux object, and you can see its little tanks of hydrochloric acid, and it's kind of injecting and it's jumping up and down. Roux, obviously, in French, has a whole other series of meanings, which was intentional. Now, another one of the input vectors is very much interested in Bramante's, isn't it? I nearly said Brunelleschi. Bramante's Tempietto. So this ideal, trying to achieve this ideal perfect Tempietto temple and the flowering of the Renaissance in about 1505. So it was originally proposed that by Bramante that the Tempietto, which is the inner bit of this plan, would have a radiating courtyard around it. That was never built, but the Tempietto was. So I was interested in this idea of how architecture doesn't do always what it's supposed to do and only is partially complete. And also was interested in tolerances and how, the ideal classical proportions are always slightly messed up by builders' ineptitude, let's call it that. So I was interested in this dichotomy between different variations, if you like, tolerances. And so we made a model of a measuring stick that would chart these differences and then be moved around by the Spanish Guard, who are around the courtyard every day. And it would kind of sense different velocities and tolerances. And they would again become input for a series of sculptures that would operate on the island through the vista. And this is the wheelbarrow with expanding bread, influenced by Hector Guimar's Paris Metro, and also by Dali's interest in the paranoid critical method, which he focused on Millet, the French painter's Millet's pictures of La Angelus, with the wheelbarrow and the wheel. There's a whole lot of stuff going on there with this. And also there's some Philip Guston in there as well. But the whole point was that the wheelbarrow would move, so the sculpture would move, as opposed to having a vista where you viewed a static sculpture down a vista. And so the idea was that you'd have this expanding bread, which obviously wasn't a real piece of bread because that would be silly, but it expands at certain points and therefore creates these parallaxes where from different people, for different things, from different positions, you can see different things or not, as the case may be. So this is a plan of a typical vista. So again, these are all influenced by the vectors and the plumb line and the fried bread, the egg on the plumb line. So that the egg on the plumb line, for example, creates the trajectories of the wheelbarrow with the expanding bread. The canoe type pieces, and you can see the expanding bread at various points, create areas of parallax where certain things are seen by some people at certain points or not. And again, you can see the notation of those views on the drawing. Now, what's in the wheelbarrows of the parallaxes, the canoes of parallax? So this is a composite drawing, two drawings overlaid in Photoshop. Why did you do that, Neil? Well, because I like it. So getting on to what's in those canoes, the canoes of parallax, I got interested in the medieval notion of the dance of death, and that idea that that no matter how pious or religious you are, or how rich or how poor, there's always death pulling at your shirt sleeves. Or so Dürer did these series of etchings that the artistic idea of the dance of death goes across absolute eons, centuries. But I just show these ones. And in those kind of canoes of parallax, I wanted to see, for the viewer who could see, something like this. This is Per Ubu. This is a photograph by Dora Maar, who was from 1939, who's one of Picasso's mistresses. And it looks like Per Ubu. Per Ubu was a very was introduced to the French public in the theatre by Alfred Jarry as a character in 1896 and caused an absolute riot when it was first. He's a kind of king of Poland before even the second version or third version of Poland existed. We think it's a kind of baby, I forget what they're called. Wanted to say avocado. But it looks exactly like Per Ubu. So this leads me on to Per Ubu. The author of Per Ubu, or the first play, Ubu Roy, King Ubu of Poland, is Alfred Jarry, and here we see him on his very, very, very modern bike at the beginning of the 20th century. Jarry was addicted to ether and alcohol and absinthe, and died, I think, about the age of 31 in 1911. But in the meantime, he left us some absolute proto-surrealist classics. The play Ubu, with its opening line, murderer. The Journeys and Opinions of Dr. Faustroll, pataphysicist. And it's pataphysics that interests me very much and is very much intrinsically involved with the Communicating Vessels project. The wheelbarrow, which Dali was interested in, comes from the factor Cheval, who was a postman, obviously, and who built this, used to push his wheelbarrow around whilst delivering letters and pick up stones and then go back and make this Palais Ideal. The interesting thing about the Palais Ideal, it's kind of reverse TARDIS. It's bigger on the outside than it is on the inside, and is only big enough to hold the wheelbarrow. So again, that interested Dali and that interests me. At the beginning of a vista is often a temple of repose. And I wanted to create an architecture that was, excuse me, let me have a drink, that was at the beginning of this vista. And it consists of a series of almost sort of prehistoric rock art laid down by a series of psychoatmospheric objects. So I'll explain those later. So again, we have, this is seen in perspective, but the idea of a psychoatmospheric object comes from Dali and Duchamp. So if we take the easy one, Duchamp, if you imagine a ball of string with two flanges over each end and the hollow bit in the middle, the spindle, as it were, has something that rattles inside, but you don't know what it is. You start to imagine, is it a stone? Is it a dice? And so that's a very simple psychoatmospheric object because you fill in what you think's inside. Dali took it one step forward, or other steps forward, which was, if you put a surrealist in a darkened room with a camera, but no flash, and you give them an object and you make them photograph it, even though they can't see it, and then you cast that camera without developing the film in lead, and then you let it condense from the molten lead on a haystack, and you'll see the haystack in the middle of the drawing. Then you've got a psychoatmospheric object. You don't know what's in it. You don't even know whether anything's been photographed. And so this Temple of Repose is about those ideas. So so when we go back to this drawing, we see a table with a series of objects. We see a baseball glove, and it's about receiving these psychoatmospheric objects, dropping them through the hole, and as the table revolves, it makes this kind of rock art radial geometry. And that's the beginning, the Temple of Repose of this vista. Now, Le Corbusier was interested in Père Ubu, and this is a drawing from, I think, something like 1953 called Ubu forms. And some of these geometries, which were repeated a lot in the 50s by Le Corbusier, but also embossed in some of the concrete elevations of his buildings. So very much interested in, so again, tying it back to sort of architecture. So these, I don't consider these finished drawings. These are just sketches, but they show the growing of certain vistas, and the vistas are angled towards certain points in my history as a teenage boy. Certain points where, I had my first kiss or whatever. So those vistas are, again, psychogeographically important, but they show over time the growing of the vistas. So here are some psychoatmospheric objects, and again, taking lessons from Factum 1 and Factum 2 from Rauschenberg, trying to do the same drawing twice. So these are the two drawings, and you can see they're different. Also, doing a skit representing the important surrealist motif of the baguette. It's a bit of Bratwurst in there as well. So these are the two drawings side by side. And it's obvious that you can't do drawings exactly the same by old traditional methods. And that's the idea that everything's equivalent and equally valid. So I superimpose them to see the variance. Put one inside the other. For the sheer hell of it. Now, what makes the geometries of the psychoatmospheric objects, I hear you cry? Well, I got interested again in second order cybernetics, and particularly Gordon Pask, who was connected to very much to the AA, and I was very lucky to see him before he died, doing a lecture at the Bartlett. And this is a rewiring ear. So if you use silver nitrate and put in a series of electric pulses, and you change the pulses, the ear, he called it, will rewire. And these structures are called dendritic structures, so they're trees. So these are from some notes on that particular thing. So there's some contemporary, relatively contemporary boxes. So I had this idea of making a genetic gazebo, which would take a series of inputs from a series of objects and then rewire them according to different algorithms to create the geometries of the psychoatmospheric objects. So this is a prehistoric insect, which obviously we can now harvest its DNA in amber. So this is the genetic gazebo. There's an existing gazebo adjacent to the site, and it has a kind of 4x4 array matrix, and you can see the kind of electric conduits. The amber piece goes in the middle there, which is that circular piece, but also it's to be combined with the idea of randomness. So there's a kind of kidney-shaped bird bath poking out the front, so that's one input, depending on where birds bathe in its kind of quadripartite geometries. And the idea of, again, taking the DNA of another animal, which was a gerbil I had in 1976 called Mickey, who died. So you've got these inputs, and they're kind of random. So going back to initially those kind of drawings originally where I was working with someone else, you can't control this. And the idea of choreographing chance becomes very much important in the trajectory of the project. So again, there's a kind of perspective of the gazebo with most of the gazebo, apart from the plan, removed. By the gazebo is a weir, and I had the idea of obviously being a good sustainable architect, that I needed to find some natural power to charge this gazebo, and this is where I came up with the big neoprene-tongued thing that would jostle about in the weir as the current changed it and create some sort of kinetic electricity, based very much on pictures, on paintings from Cézanne, actually. Now, every surrealist professor has to have a chess set. So this is obviously a queen. Various elements. The pawns are the inside of a pigeon's ear, and I may come back to that. There's queens and there's kings, and the king is there's bishops, and you can see the bishop form. There's a baroness, so it's a 10, it's 100 square thing as opposed to chessboard as opposed to 64, because it has baronesses in it, and the baroness is very important to the communicating vessels project. Now, what I'm very conscious of, and I should have said at the front, is because there's thousands of drawings for the communicating vessels, I'm only telling you a partial story. So the knight is obviously the wheelbarrow with expanding bread, because it is the knight's move, and the knight's move is very much a surrealist, because it's the one that moves in that kind of L shape. So it has swerve. And if we go back to pataphysics, Jarry created this literary proto-surrealism, which was very much about three declensions of pataphysics. One is hybridity, one is clinamen, which is the swerve of the atom from Lucretius to make matter as it descends to Earth, and the swerves are important. And the other is syzygia, which is when three planets align in space. And it's those conjunctions of the extremely disparate that is so crucial to the Communicating Vessels project. But equally, it's a memory theatre, so it tells me where I've been in the past, in a way. Now, the whole island is kind of ruled by the Baroness, and the Baroness has electromagnetic tendrils. So here we can see her sensing across one of those vistas. There's a whole series of drawings about how you make a Baroness, which I won't show you, which are fairly recent. And then my favorite title for a drawing, which is the Baroness's electromagnetic tendrils caressing the bulb of the wheelbarrow with expanding bread under the disconcerted and disapproving composite eye of a wasp. I was pleased with that title. Another piece of art, there's very much the Communicating Vessels oscillates between art, architecture, surrealism, poetry. So this is Velasquez, Las Meninas. So it's I think it's Philip II's court, but I'm not sure. And what's interesting about that, I mean, it's very famous indeed. So you can see lots of people have done skits on it. But so in 1957, Picasso started to look at it and started to reinterpret it. And the key is in the top middle is those hooks, the meat hooks that Picasso said he wanted to hang his hands on. And they are chandelier hooks. And the hook, or the meat hook, as I call it, is very important to the Communicating Vessels. But Picasso went through many iterations, becoming more and more abstract. And you see the hooks are represented by this kind of asterisk in the top there. And then I started to sort, well, you know, the Communicating Vessels is quite complicated, and you can't expect people to know anything or infer the nuances. So I started to produce a manual, and the idea of the manual was that the manual was even madder than the Communicating Vessels. But here's some pages from that manual. So this double-page spread is called "What Are You Looking At?" So it's about the desiring eye, but equally the internal, the meat hook, which is taken from the homing pigeon's inner ear. You can see at the top, on the top left, and that appears in various bits of work. Another piece, another double-page spread from the manual is, I think it's 1949. Duchamp and Frederick Keisler did an issue of View, and so this is one of the backing pieces interpolated with some of my pieces. But equally, on the right-hand side, there's Gordon Path's Conversation Theories, diagrams. So again, it gives you clues about the nuances of the communicating vessels. Another piece from that era was there's a fire in the basement. Now, in 2012, I've tended to, in recent years, kind of memorialize some of my friends who've passed away. And the first imperative for this was when Lebbeus Woods passed away in 2012 during Hurricane Sandy. It wasn't anything to do with Hurricane Sandy, but he'd been poorly for some time. So I wanted to, again, use augmented reality on the island, and I created this walled garden. So there's a series of things. There's a kind of crucifix. I'm not even sure that Lebbeus would have liked that. There's a series of cypress trees. There's a series of kind of striated walls, and there's a fustrum, which is obviously a quote from another architect I'm a fan of, Aldo Rossi. So this is the first drawing, and there were two drawings. Then there's a kind of sort of perspective, and the figure at the bottom is called Electra. And the idea was that Electra has a hollow head. So if you stand and put your head in the back of her head, you can hear and see through her eyes and ears. And what happens when that happens is there's a storm, and the storm comes and goes, and that's very much the kind of memorial garden for Lebbeus. So here's a composite drawing. There was a whole series. So I started to get into, I don't say we, I was doing it on my own. Meteorological drawings and pressure gradient drawings that come from the movement of this storm across this memorial garden. And there's various versions. I mean, there's a suite of about 25 drawings. There's virtual snow, there's all sorts of things. I tend to work, I don't always work. When the muse comes, stuff happens, but I can't control when the muse comes particularly. I can push it about a bit, but and various vectors form and start to quote, even in the Lebbeus garden, some of the previous projects, and that's why I showed you them as the Dorian Gray column starting to form. It's Dorian Gray column again. One of the drawings from the Lebbeus garden. And you can see the turd-like objects. You can see the watcher. You can see the Dorian Gray column. And then you strip out the garden, and you can see the meat hook and various other things. Anyway, so you can see various iterations. But it also occurred to me that you don't have to see storm through the back of Electra's head. You can see gold. And so this is the Lebbeus Woods gold drawing, which was featured in the 2015 Royal Academy Summer Show. It sold very well. Seemed to be popular. And then, of course, the storm subsides, and you get a new dawn. So there's just Electra standing there, and you start to see the contours of the walled garden, but none of the kind of virtual augmented reality vectors. And then looking further back across the river, you start to see this new dawn starting to form. So I'm going to just finish with this last piece, which completes the walled garden, really. So this is Arnold Böcklin's Island of Death, I think it's called. So you see sort of Sharon there, Sharon, and his boat with a dead person in a shroud going to the Isle of Death. Giacometti, here we see Giacometti's The Palace at 4 a.m., I think it is, or 3 a.m. And I wanted to finish the Lebbeus garden on the island, on the communicating vessels island. I also wanted to evoke our dear friend Marcel Duchamp. I think this is called the Sex Cylinder, which was one of the initial drawings for the large glass. And Piranesi, I think this is plate 9 of the second edition. And that gateway was being used by quite a few architects. I think it was used for the gateway into Bedlam or Newgate Prison as well in the later on. But anyway, and you get this large oculus open to the sky. So I wanted this, so I started to concentrate on that frustum, that Aldo Rossi type truncated cone in the beginning of at the bottom of the Lebbeus garden. And so I started to look at the inside and starting to take reference from that plate number 9 and the gateway and the idea of the storm going over the top, and suddenly the ambience inside the top. There's 2 chambers in the top, in the cone, and one at the top and one at the bottom. And I'll show you what's in both. This is the top. And the idea of this figure, again, like Giacometti's Palace at 4 a.m. or 3 a.m., kind of moves in and out like a cuckoo clock, starting to influence what's happening based on the ambience of in the oculus and how much darkness there is or light as the storm passes through. So again, it gets darker and darker. The second chamber is very much to do with Leader and the Swan. So this is a 1940s Man Ray drawing, painting of Leader and the Swan. And of course, that's a whole other kind of mythical thing. Zeus dresses up as the swan and either rapes or makes love to Leda. And that's been depicted as a 1930s or 1920s kind of Art Nouveau representation. I think there's a poem by W.B. Yeats as well. So again, could be quite saucy. So the idea is that the bottom of the cone is filled with the grease or the holy gasoline. And as the lady at the top goes in and out because of the form, because of the the gradient of lighting, it starts to reveal and the grease starts to make in its nanotechnological sort of way a representation of Leader and the Swan. And these are the stages. As the grease starts to form and make things. So this is Leader and the Swan. You see the swan and the brown figure at the bottom. And the meat hook appears again. Not quite sure why. So I'm going to stop there, Lucas. Otherwise, I'll go on far too long.
Okay, that's great. No, thank you very much, Neil. Yeah, I think we're all kind of like, or at least I've entered into a sort of
It's a
very
heavy,
meditative,
it's a
meditative
heavy
state.
thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, great. Well, I think we could maybe open the space for a few questions. Maybe I can kick off a couple questions that I have written down here. Well, there's a lot of questions that sort of emerged in during your talk, and I've noticed a couple things, like a couple patterns in your thinking and your approach. Um, but I have questions, sort of this this literary or mythological, these interests that you have. Where do they enter? I mean, did I'm assuming you didn't learn them at architecture school. Uh,
No.
so I'm kind of curious, sort of
I start,
yeah, how does this come into your life, and how does this become part of your work? Um, I don't know.
yeah,
Could you maybe
I
talk
didn't
about?
learn them at architecture school. I sensed that architecture was strangely blind to a variety of cultural imperatives. Um, and it started by being interested in surrealism and the way the surrealists started to explore myth and automatic writing or automatic drawing, the exquisite corpse, all those sorts of things. So it came after I'd graduated. Um, and I started to work in an architectural office, and I did that for 10 years, but drawing in the evening as well. So I was fundamentally bored by architecture per se. Don't get me wrong, I did some amazing, well, I didn't do some amazing things, but I had I got to meet some amazing people. But so it started after that because I was interested also, and round about the early 90s, I started reading, William Gibson and cyberspace and Neuromancer and all that stuff. So I started to get interested in the form of the novel, the science fiction. I read a lot of science fiction. I don't anymore, but or not much. I started to get interested in science fiction authors, very much one that I admire immensely called Jeff Noon, who's not very well known, but won an Arthur C. Clarke um, uh, medal one year for his book called Vurt, V-U-R-T, which is about a post-apocalyptic Manchester, which of course you wouldn't find, most people don't find interesting, but it was a whole series of works that came out of that. So that, Neil Stevenson and Snow Crash and all that. But also interested, again, I was always fundamentally interested in, the long project, as I said before, I
Uh-huh.
was interested in um, Daniel Libeskind, I think was the first time or Mike Webb. So Mike's interested in parallax and speed and velocity and a particular kind of place where he grew up, which was Henley in England. And so I started to want to do something that was intrinsically linked to where I'd grown up as well. And of course, they're both about rivers in a way, um, but also islands. And I was very interested in the literature of islands, whether that's,
Mm.
well, you think about anything islands. They're a kind of microcosm. They're a paracosm, as you say in your introduction.
Mhm.
So I was very much interested in that, but also very much interested in. I realized at a certain point I didn't need to impress anyone. Architects are like, oh, I'm going to show you a drawing, and do you like it? Do you like it? I don't care whether you like it or not. But I know I've done a good one sometimes. So, the idea of going off-piste, if you like, and saying, I don't care whether you employ me again. Um, and actually, that's been quite successful and very liberating. Um, I'm not saying everyone can do it.
Yeah.
But there's only a few of us who get away with it, really. So I don't know if that, I guess that answers your
Yeah,
question. That was a long answer.
yeah, more or less. Maybe I have more questions, but I maybe I can open this up to the audience if somebody wants to ask something. Um,
Often people get a bit stunned at this point.
well, I can follow up. Let's see. So I guess I have a question for you. Are you because it's not clear to me, and maybe that's a good thing. I'm not saying that it should be clear, but are you drawing? Are you designing? Are you telling a story? That's sort of you're kind of doing all of them at once, but I'm kind of curious, especially when you talk, you should start to show us some sketches, and then you show us. There was the one of the earlier drawings you showed us, um, which had a which had a bicycle wheel, a Duchamp bicycle wheel in it. And you showed us
Yeah, yeah,
a plan, and then you showed us in perspective.
yeah.
So, there is a kind of a constructed drawing process. I don't know if you consider that if that term,
Yeah,
works
I
for
mean,
you.
I was educated as an architect. I think architecturally. So I think about space. I think about time. I think about, as Bernard would say, event. So I very much think as an architect, and that I think makes my work kind of consciously different. But I am designing. I'm telling a story. I'm letting the drawings sometimes help me tell that story. I sometimes do the drawings and then invent the story afterwards. Not always. It varies. I might be inspired by poetry. I might be inspired by a title for a drawing that's from a piece of heavy metal. Whatever. I just take my inspiration where it comes from. Um, and sometimes it just hits me. There can be many months where nothing hits me at all.
Mhm.
Um, but then again, I've built up a large oeuvre of work that, you know, I'm working again at the moment, but I'm nowhere near getting you to the point where, where I am now in my head. I can't do it in an hour.
Yeah.
I probably couldn't do it in 3 hours. So this work gets you to about 2015.
Okay.
And there's a lot of other stuff. But it's always related to the communicating vessels and the characters. And in a way, it's sort of like Perez Gomez and his, the Dark Forest Revisited. It's it's about referencing to a variety of other stuff that goes on that other people have done. And I want to contribute to that conversation in my own way. So, whether that's Liebeskind or Temple Island with Mike or, Archigram or all sorts.
Mhm.
So I've been very lucky to know all these people. And for example, Cedric Price, when we published our first little monograph under our own publication, Cedric very kindly, without even knowing us, wrote the introduction. We sent him some pictures, some photos as they would have been in the old days, and we met him, and he was a big fan. And that out of Cedric sort of writing that, then came the gig at the Bartlett in 1992. And I was there for 20 years, really happily, working with Peter and various other people. So that I've been very lucky to be accepted into that coterie of people, um, which I always wanted to be. But of course, coming from a sort of provincial polytechnic in outside London, where no one actually gave a shit about anything in terms of that sort of tradition, I've been very lucky to be accepted into that. So I'm grateful for that because that's very inspiring.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Um,
And the conversations you have are amazing.
mhm. No,
What a good day.
it is about a dialogue with certain people. So yeah, exactly. Certainly, yeah.
It's very much, yeah, yeah, very much.
Well, and that was a question, but there's a question from Peter Baldwin, but do have a follow-up question, but maybe I want to open this to the audience. Given that practice might be seen as a form of scrying, I can't help but wonder what a retrospective review of some of the earlier technological speculations might yield.
Well, in terms of what my speculations were and how they turned out to be, or how science turned out to be, or technology turned out to be latterly. If I take it as that sort of way, yes, I was wrong a lot of the time, but that's absolutely cruel. I like being wrong. Wrong's good. Being accurate. I think a lot of people nowadays, talking about AI, for example, they're going to be wrong, and they just have to take it, and that's okay. I don't mind that. I think as you get older, I'm getting on now, and I don't care about those sorts of things anymore. I just do my stuff
Mhm.
when I can be bothered. Because you can't, it's sometimes it feels like urinating down a drain. You know, you do stuff. Look at this drawing. This drawing's amazing. Um, does the world fly past? Yeah, of course it does. And then you have to be resilient enough to go, look, I've produced an amazing drawing there. No one's going to take any notice, but it doesn't matter. They notice in the end. I mean, one of the interesting things that Peter Cook said to me years ago was it takes 30 years till anyone notices you. And this was about 92 when the Archigram exhibition in the Pompidou Centre started. Yeah.
I don't
And
think
I think that's an important observation.
sorry, Neil, I wasn't a question of rightness or wrongness. It was a question of how would you reread some of those technical and technological projections thinking forwardly about where technology is going. And you've mentioned the AI, the sort of genie that's now out of the bottle. I suppose it was wondering, would there be a value in rereading some of those, things like the aerogel, which of course was heralded as a great technological advance, and nanotech as well. I just kind of wonder where the work positions those things.
Well, I mean, it's a good question. I thought about writing a book that took digital dreams, which you'll be familiar with, which I wrote in the 90s, and saying, well, where it all goes different. And then I thought, oh, that will bore me. Yeah, no, I'm not. It doesn't really matter to me. I'm not particularly interested in lessons I've learned. I just do stuff.
Fair enough.
I've got nothing to teach young people about where I've been before. I just like showing them the pictures. What I have noticed, and we better declare. Peter and I have been teaching at Birmingham for the last few months, and there's he's one of the owners. He's the only owner of the wheelbarrow with expanding bread, which you can just see over his shoulder, which he very kindly bought for me a few weeks ago. So he's the only one who actually owns a communicating vessels drawing, and I'm very pleased he does. But no, what we found, and I say this with love, is students aren't very interested anymore. And actually, I think probably most of them weren't anyway. Even going back to when I was a student, they all have wonderful careers, obviously, but It's how you fend off the boredom, I think. Or how you speculate about space. And I think that's one of the problems that we've got in architectural education currently. There aren't enough people speculating about the nature of space or materiality. I mean, they're all, doing this hubris thing of, oh, we can save the world with bits of turnip made into a wall or something, Anyway, don't get me on that one.
Well, I guess I could maybe give you a concluding question, unless somebody else has a burning question um, about that. Because I was thinking a little bit about when you were talking about your work, and then you would mention the surrealists, and then you would, you know, and I was thinking, a lot of this knowledge. I had an art teacher, and when I studied, who kind of complained that we expected that students were always expecting to learn things through books. And there's nothing, and I don't think there's. I mean, I love books, and I use them a lot, to sort of absorb knowledge, to gain, to understand things. But there is some a side of it that is about maybe going outside, looking, interacting with people, having discussions. And there's a lot of knowledge that comes from that, or there's a lot of learning or experience that comes from that. So I don't know, would you, speak to that a little bit? Could you,
But it's
yeah.
very important. Traveling is very important to see. I've done well a lot of cities. I particularly like Florence, Rome, and Venice. I'm particularly interested in the Renaissance, and to see those, like the Laurentian Library, face to face, or the baptistry at in Florence, the doors or whatever, are absolutely crucial, and they become touchstones for what happens in the future in terms of my own design. Bernini, Borromini, all the bees who I had trouble separating when I was a student, Brunelleschi, or all the other bees, the Piazza Navona. These are crucial things to see. If you don't see them, you don't understand them. You can see as many photographs as you like, but if you're there and you experience them and you experience the scale of them, I think is very, very important. I know I'm just going on about Italy, but Greece is the same, or London. It goes Rennes, Vanbrugh, Hawksmoor.
Mhm.
Seeing all this stuff, it's very, very important. And then you might sort of go, oh, I really enjoyed that. I didn't know I was going to enjoy that. I might find a book on that.
Mhm.
But I didn't, as a student, I had a very good architectural history course, but I was mostly in bed, you know,
Mhm.
sometimes on my own, sometimes not. Um, the timing of the architectural history and theory, which I think is fundamental. And I don't think nowadays that history and theory is taught properly. I think it's too hubristic. I think it's too, well, not hubristic, well, hubristic, under, trying to sort of get the idea that architects can solve the world's problems. We don't do that with the second oldest profession. I won't tell you who the first oldest profession is that do things for money, but that's it.
Mhm.
You're just an architect. That's the key. When I see people describe themselves as architects and activists, what's all that about? That doesn't mean you don't have a political position. It doesn't mean that your political position is not right, but you're an architect. It's like asking a car mechanic and activist. It's just silly.
All right. Well, thank you, Neil. I don't know if anyone else has any other questions. I think maybe we can conclude there. Um,
Well, thank you, Lucas. Thank
no,
you for inviting me,
yeah, thank you
and
very
I
much.
hope
I think it
I
was,
hope I,
go ahead, go ahead.
I hope I haven't gone on and ranted.
No, no, I think there's certainly things in the discipline that are shifting and changing, and I think what I appreciate about what you presented today is, I mean, even looking at the construction lines, which I did learn to draft by hand. I was at the end of that in schools, and sort of, recalling things that happened that had an importance, um, that in a way have an implicit importance still today, the I guess techniques that have that, I don't know, maybe we see them less, but that have a value, like you said, and maybe in 30 years, we'll all want to return to sort of some kind of hand drafting, or like recuperate the techniques. So that's something I think that's very valuable in your work, and there's a lot of thinking, there's a lot of philosophical undertones, this idea of doing a drawing twice, um, and neither one is, they're not the same. A lot of your terms that you were using, input vectors, um, parallax, pataphysics, all these things I think are references that I mean, it's great that you can introduce them into an architectural discourse, right, through these drawings. And so,
Mm.
thank you very much for presenting your work. And I think by the end of it, we were all kind of in a meditative state, like just seeing this constant work and this ability to sort of continue a long-term project, which I think is also harder and harder, but there's a great value in that, sort of being able to sort of take steps throughout the years and sort of build upon drawings and stories and designs and ideas, most of all. So thank you very much for presenting all that.
Well, thank you, Lucas, for inviting me. I enjoyed chatting, and I hope I've made some sorts of sense. And like I said, you're only getting a kind of partial thing. We're probably up to 2015. We're now 11 years on top of that. So there you are. So, but yes, I mean, it kind of, I think, illustrates the imperative of the work, really. So thank you again.
Yeah. Well, I hope we can see the other work. I mean, maybe not so soon, but eventually, yeah, in a
Well, if
book
you
or in an
ask me, I'll think
exhibition.
about it. Well,
Yeah.
I've wanted to do the Communicating Vessels book for 20 years. Um, and I got very close 3 times. Publishers don't like to have monographs anymore, really, unless you're Lebius or Zaha. Well, they haven't even done Lebius yet. But yeah, there's a lot of anxiety in the publishing industry as well, particularly in relation to architecture, because most architecture students don't read anymore, which is a very big shame.
Yeah, but I would love to read it. So let's hope that the fourth
I'd love
time
to write
chance
it.
is a charm. So all right. Well, thank you very much. So I guess we'll
Oh,
conclude this.
cheers.
And thank you everyone for
Thank you.
connecting. And we have our next talk next week with Brian Cantley, Friday at 2 p.m. Mexican Central Time, which is in about 3 hours. Well, not in 3 hours, in a week, but of your time now, about 3 hours. Thank you.
Cheers. Bye bye.